Hello, hello. Just want to make sure that we are live. I think we are. Alrighty. Make sure it's on the best quality. Okay. Awesome. Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Welcome back. Alrighty, we're live. It's so good to see you again, and thank you so much for joining me on this incredible Friday. We've just had such an amazing tropical storm happening out here, and it's so beautiful to be surrounded by nature, and it's just incredible. So I see there's a hey Kim, how are you? So good to see you. I'm so glad you could catch me live. Okay, guys, so I've really been looking forward to today's session. Hey Trace, nice to see you, sweetie. Hi. As you come on in, guys, say hey. So the reason I've been looking so forward to today's session is because I have yet to meet someone that doesn't have an emotional trigger. Okay, people experience these intense reactions to something seemingly so small, and they have no idea, why that reaction occurred, or worse yet, they simply don't have the tools to understand how to soothe those triggers. For those of you who are jumping in and who don't know me yet, by the way, I'm Sam and I'm your confidence and mindset coach. And I work with women all around the globe to live with purpose and clarity and confidence, and really help them to reclaim their power and control over both their personal and professional lives. So, as I was saying, today we're going to be talking about soothing those emotional triggers. And I'm going to help you to identify your triggers, as well as determine how your triggers are formed. And of course, I'm going to give you all the tools that you need to soothe them, so that when they do come up, you're able to move through those emotions much more quickly. So, for those of you who maybe not yet are familiar with this term, an emotional trigger is really, it's a memory or a past experience or event that sparks a really intense emotion, okay, regardless of your current mood. Okay, you may have heard the phrase about pushing someone's buttons, and that's typically also regarded as a trigger. So I see there's more people hopping on. Please say hey so that I know that you're here. Give me a like or a heart, show me some love, tell me where you're watching from. If you've got any questions along the way, you know where to drop them in the comments box. Okay, I'll answer as many as I can. Obviously, if you're watching the replay, just drop me a hashtag replay as well, so I know you stopped on by. Alrighty, so let's just jump in. I've got quite a lot to cover for you today. So on any given day, you're probably experiencing quite a range of emotions, maybe excitement, unease, frustration, joy, disappointment, whatever. And these are often related to a specific event, maybe seeing your partner, or meeting with your boss, or chatting with a friend about some current events. But sometimes we're faced with somebody raising their voice at us and we feel shaky, or a door is slammed and we instantly become angry or alarmed. Someone acts aggressively towards us and then we go to pieces. We've all been in that kind of similar situation. And so whenever any of these sort of things happen, it's likely that it's triggered an emotion, and we find ourselves in a common stimulus response pattern. And so when our triggers are pulled, the best thing for us to actually do is to take a step back and have a deep look into the origins of those reactions to determine how they were formed. And from there, we can start to understand it and then, of course, heal it. And we all have it within us to respond to a trigger rather than react to it, but we just need to equip ourselves with some of those tools. So what specifically is a trigger? So as I mentioned, it's a word, a person, event, experience that sets off an immediate emotional reaction. And that's known as having your button pushed. It's like, for example, if you're startled by a noise, okay? The noise is the trigger, the startle is the response, And so basically we're feeling fine a moment earlier, but then a certain event happened, and then in a millisecond, we're upset and thrown off balance and irrational. So we may find ourselves acting out of control in ways that are extremely unskillful, really, even damaging, to ourselves and to others. And our reactions to our emotional triggers are often excessive, and they last longer than what makes sense for that event, right? It's as if we're still jumping at the sound of that slammed door hours later. And while not all triggers are negative, we usually use the word trigger to describe a negative stimuli. Those that set off sadness, anger, fear, hurt, shame, despair. So knowing what your emotional triggers are, and obviously how to deal with them, is a key component of good emotional health. And as I mentioned, I've yet to meet a person that doesn't have some kind of emotional trigger, though these might look a little different from person to person. They might include reminders of unwanted memories or uncomfortable topics, another person's words or actions, or even your own behaviors. And so a key step in learning to recognize your triggers involves paying attention when those situations generate that strong emotional response. And so when we're triggered, what tends to happen is that our bodies engage in the survival response of fighting, fleeing, or freezing. So our hearts might race, we might break out into a cold sweat or go cold, maybe we get an upset tummy or feel dizzy or get sweaty palms. So the sympathetic nervous system is being activated here to save us from this perceived harm. So we know that fight and flight response serves as an important sort of evolutionary function. When danger is sensed, the amygdala in our brain signals our body to release massive amounts of stress and, stress-related hormones and peptides. And because rapid response is critical in life-threatening situations, the amygdala receives the signal and reacts in milliseconds before the cortex actually has a chance to process the information. So these responses were super useful in life-threatening situations back in caveman days, but you can see the problem this response presents in this sort of everyday life now. Okay, the primitive neural systems can't distinguish between emotional threats to our ego and the threat of death to our body. So someone says or does something that triggers our emotional wiring, our body reacts as if it were a life-threatening situation, and then we're incapable of dealing with the situation at hand because of all these crazy hormones coursing through our bloodstream. And it's typically only after that rush of hormones subside that we realize, a little too late I might add, that we reacted inappropriately. So we often flee too fast, or we freeze too long, or we fight too hard in these situations. And these reactions can really start to interfere with our ability to live our lives. And when a trigger leads only to a survival reaction, it's kind of a dead end. But they can also lead us to healing as well. They can point us to where we have that internal work that needs to be done. The challenge is that our reactions happen so fast that they erase the distance between that stimulus and response time, and it makes it feel like they're one and the same thing. Okay, I'm drinking, I need to drink. I've been talking a lot. So triggers thrive on sort of an illusion that we can't trust ourselves. But once we have access to those inner resources, we can then learn to catch ourselves instead of reacting blindly. And then we can trust that we can handle whatever it is that we feel. So when you notice these signs, stop to consider just what happened and the response that it activated. Try following these feelings right back to their origins by thinking back on other situations that made you feel what you're currently feeling. And I'll go into that a little bit more in one of our next steps. But first, let's try and understand where these triggers come from. So I'd like to just point out that not all emotional responses are trigger reactions. So you receiving bad news about a sudden death of a friend or a relative is normal, okay? And it's normal to react with shock and grief, okay? But it is not healthy to avoid or control those emotions because they need to be felt. But when we have a strong reaction to a less significant event, it's like the past is invading the present, right? Our triggers are so very personal, and things that trigger me may not trigger you at all, okay? Because they come from events and situations and circumstances from our respective pasts. Going back to the amygdala for a second, not only does this part of the brain initiate the fight-flight response, but it also forms and stores our memories that are associated with emotional events. So this is also why our responses seem so out of proportion with the triggering incident, because of these stored memories of the past experiences that have now just come flooding back up. So let's look at a common example of triggering. Imagine someone with authority making a dismissive comment about your work, okay? Some of us may not have a problem with this kind of remark and it rolls like water off a duck's back, but others of us will get triggered. We respond either with fight, so we get defensive, begin to argue or get angry, or we head towards flight and shut down. And the intensity of our reaction is not just about this person and this remark. It's about a lifetime of similar experiences, perhaps going all the way back to, feeling very young and hearing our father's voice expressing disappointment in our grades, and then being flooded with all the old feelings of just not being good enough in his eyes, right? So we focus on the person and their remark as the source of danger. But actually, the real threat is what we carry inside, okay? Our triggers evoke powerful chains of emotions and memories, usually tracing back to our childhood. So our triggers may be birthed in sort of the common traumas of growing up, not feeling valued by a parent, being the youngest child who was always left out, being held back in school or rejected by peers, or the impact of maybe an emotionally absent parent. And for others, the chain leads to more dramatic wounding, such as maybe the death of a family member, divorce, traumatic accidents, alcoholism in the family, emotional, physical abuse, or maybe the impact of oppression on members of marginalized groups. It doesn't take much to hurt sensitive young beings. And this initial shock to our system becomes the template upon which other hurts get layered, okay, until there's what we call a core wound. And the core wound is so sensitive, so painful, that we will honestly just do anything or whatever it takes we can to avoid feeling that. It's also the stimulation of this wound that causes the amygdala to interpret the trigger as a life and death situation and initiate that fight-flight response. And so I've seen about 8 categories of triggers, and this may not be all of them, but I think these are sort of the most prevalent in my opinion. Oh, and before I forget, before I get to telling you what those are, I just also wanted to point out that we don't choose to have the reactions that we have, right? Triggering happens far too quickly for our rational mind to intercept the amygdala's command to activate the fight-flight response. So please don't judge yourself or be critical about these, okay? Just see if you can recognize one or more of these as your triggers. And then give me the number or the numbers in the comments so that I know I'm not alone, because I can see myself in a lot of these. But the first one is feeling self-conscious either when we're alone or in a group or comparing ourselves to others. The second one is being overlooked excluded, or ignored, such as when somebody stands us up or ignores our calls, or maybe we passed up for a job opportunity or promotion. Number 3 is feeling like we're being controlled, or a helplessness or some kind of loss of control, like when someone's making decisions for us or telling us what to do or say. Number 4 is feeling like we're being taken advantage of, like maybe when somebody doesn't pay us back on money that we loaned them. Number 5 is being vulnerable or insecure, like when we're in a situation where we feel exposed or unsafe. Number 6 is relationship experiences, like when we feel smothered or too needed, or maybe on the flip side, feeling unwanted or unneeded. And number 7 is feeling uncomfortable with what's happening. So for example, when we witness someone being hurt, or when someone's words or actions are at odds with our values. And the last one is fearing what might happen. So for example, abandonment or rejection or disapproval. So don't forget to let me know which of these you can recognize as triggers in yourself. And I see we've got a couple more people that have joined us. So please, as you hop in, say hey so I know that you're here. So, wait, water. So these seemingly ordinary life events can and often do remind us of past traumas. And this is why they can cause such an outburst of emotion. So during a traumatic event, we often dissociate from what's happening because it's just so painful. And it makes this memory really difficult to retrieve. And sometimes it can take years for that repressed feeling to be able to be felt. And we typically rely on our inner clock to say, hey, it's time to deal with these feelings. But with triggers, it's totally different. The trigger hurls us into the bodily memory of the trauma before we're actually ready to face it consciously. And that's also why we feel like such a childlike powerlessness when we're triggered. I mean, how many of you can relate to feeling that childlike powerlessness when you've had your trigger pulled, right? So let me know in the comments, because I know that's happened to me. The one thing I also just wanted to say right now is that you can't blame yourself for this, okay? You need to handle this with the utmost compassion, okay? Because when a trigger is pulled, your body is in survival mode. It is trying to keep you safe and it is trying to protect you. So in order to start digging into the origins of this trigger, we need to get curious, okay? Understanding the phenomena of triggering and knowing our triggers is an important first step, because without awareness, we're going to continue to be at the mercy of our triggers, okay? With awareness, we begin to have the possibility of then making different choices about what we do when we're triggered. And sometimes that connection isn't quite as clear as you know, so you might need to do a little bit more digging. Kim says, yeah, she feels that from time to time. Well, you know, that's the beauty of triggers, right? Fortunately, they don't happen all the time. They're generally spaced out. Well, that's my experience anyway. But when strong emotions come up, don't try to ignore them or fight them, okay? Instead, just approach them with curiosity to get more insight on what may have triggered them. And what's most important is that we focus our attention in the right direction, okay? In the moments of triggering, our attention is riveted on the seeming cause of the trigger, okay? We think we know what the problem is. We're like, it's totally about the other person or that external event. No. Okay? We need to train ourselves to recognize that the intensity of the reaction is not caused by that triggering event or person. These feelings, our core wounding, our conditioning already exist. A trigger is basically just a response that is waiting to be stimulated, basically like an accident that's primed to happen. Okay? So, do any patterns stand out, for example? Relationship discussions might bring up envy and frustration related to your fear of being alone, maybe. Once you've identified your emotional triggers, you might think, that was easy. All I have to do is avoid these situations. Well, it's not really that simple though. Okay, you can't avoid or escape from every difficult situation that life throws at you. And it's pretty much a guarantee that unpleasant emotions are going to come up occasionally. So in other words, you're actually better off scrapping that getaway plan, okay, and preparing yourself to deal with any triggers that might come up in your day-to-day life. So when a trigger happens, there's actually a whole chain of associations and reactions that occur within that moment of being triggered. And so their first response is kind of like an impulse to attempt to refute or push away or escape that triggering stimulus. And that usually sounds like, screw you, I give up. It's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Okay, you get the gist. So triggering can be thought of like an elevator shaft. The very top floor is our very first reaction to that triggering event. Under that first reaction lies the second floor, and that is a deeper, typically more vulnerable feeling. And then beneath that, there's several more floors, each with deeper, less readily accessible emotional or physical feeling. And then finally, we come to the basement, which is usually a core wound, which typically traces way back to our childhood. And these core wounds are usually so sensitive and painful that we're desperate to avoid feeling it. The stimulation of this wound helps cause the amygdala to interpret that trigger as a life or death situation and initiate the fight-flight response. And it's also this core wound that drives this whole pattern of getting triggered. So I'll give you an example. Let's say the trigger is Susan tells Jane that she didn't do something right at work. The initial reaction from Jane, which is now the top floor, is that she feels defensive and she tries to deny it. The second floor down, Jane is feeling weak and sick, feeling in her stomach. Maybe she feels anxious and says, well, what if Susan was right? What if I really did screw up? The third floor down, Jane thinks, well, if she's right, then I'm not good at what I do. The fourth floor down, Jane starts to spiral thinking, well, if I'm not good enough, or if I'm not good at what I do, then I'm not worthy. The fifth floor down, she's at like, well, if I'm not worthy, then I'm not lovable. Okay, you can see where this is going. The basement, which is now the core wound, leads to, well, if I'm unlovable, then I'm completely unloved and I'll be alone for the rest of my life. It almost feels like, what's the point in living? So once we've traced it back and identified that whole pattern down to the core wound, we must then examine how the sensitivity has repeated itself throughout our life in other contexts and relationships. Okay, so then we can trace it back through time, looking for what appears to be the origins of this pattern, back to the earliest memory of having felt this way. So to continue with the example with Jane, as she looks back on her life, the pattern of feeling defensive about her performance has been a recurring theme. It's played out not only at work, but also in her love relationships. It's getting a bit hot in here. So her earliest memories of this pattern are coming home from school with maybe 3 A's and a B. And her father's only reaction was like, well, what happened that you only got a B? So she grew up feeling that she could never do anything well enough for him and that anything less than perfect just wasn't okay. His love felt conditional on her performance. So can you kind of start to see how everything is starting to connect? I really hope that this is helping you today, because it really is imperative that we start to recognize these patterns in order for us to start moving through them. Else we're just going to keep reliving that same pattern over and over again, And I know that because you're watching this, I know that you don't want to be that person who relives these triggers over and over again like Groundhog Day. So let's do something about them, okay? So here is the 4-step formula. Number 1, name it. Number 2, take space appropriately. Step 3, shift your state. Step 4, respond to the situation. Okay, so let's dig into each a little bit more. Step 1, name it. So identify what's happening and say to yourself, I'm triggered. Unless you do this, you're helpless. Naming it won't make the stress hormones stop, but the moment that you say, I'm triggered, you've woken up your adult self, and we can now have a chance of diffusing the trigger instead of letting the amygdala run away with the emotions. And so a few more signs to be on the lookout for as telltale signs of being triggered. And don't forget, these may be different for all of us, but we may feel hot. Our stomach or jaw may begin to clench. Our voice may involuntarily start to rise. We maybe feel intensely judgmental of the person or situation. Maybe we just space out and have trouble thinking. Personally, I get pins and needles in my fingers. So as we learn to identify our particular telltale signs of being triggered, it becomes increasingly easy for us to name it, right? So you can keep a written list with names of familiar or repeated triggers. And then, as we discussed, that could be people, words, places, behaviors. Just being on the lookout for those triggers also makes us ready for them. And then we're able to respond consciously instead of acting on reflex. Also, remind yourself that it is totally okay to feel whatever it is that you're feeling in that moment. Sad, angry, afraid, mad, whatever, okay? Triggers can evoke plenty of emotions, and that's normal, okay? Denying or ignoring what makes you denying or ignoring what you feel generally only makes things worse, okay? So it can help to remind yourself of the differences between the past and the present, but do so with compassion for yourself, not judgment. So imagine, a 5-year-old version of you standing in front of you. What would you say to her when she's facing the same trigger? So step 2 is to take space appropriately. And the key word here is appropriately. The key to state shifting is to remember to not act when triggered. Once you've been able to name it, okay, the critical next step in state shifting is to then take space appropriately from that triggering situation. And there's really 2 reasons for this, right? Number 1, if you stay in the situation, you're probably just going to keep getting re-triggered. And number 2, if you stay in the situation, you're likely to say or do something you're going to regret later on. So for those of us who tend towards the fight response, taking appropriate space may feel like you're going against all of your instincts, which are screaming at you to defend yourself. And here is an important note for those of you who tend to avoid conflict and difficult interactions. Taking space appropriately does not mean that you're off the hook for dealing with that triggering situation, okay? The whole purpose of state shifting is really to help you be better, or better able, rather, to respond to those situations that trigger you. And we'll talk about that more in step 4. But for now, step 3 is to shift your state. So once we're no longer actively provoked by that trigger, because now we've taken the necessary space, the fight-flight response will usually subside gradually, okay? And then we can start to return to a place of balance. But that can take a while, right? Recovery time is impacted by things like the intensity of the trigger, as well as the degree of emotional reaction or neurological trauma. The recovery time is sort of also impacted by how quickly you remove yourself from that triggering situation. And thirdly, it's also impacted by your general state of mind and your body wellness. So just so you know, we're more susceptible to being triggered when we're overtired or have low blood sugar levels and that sort of thing. So just be on the lookout for that. These same factors also influence how quickly we can recenter ourselves after having been triggered, okay? Because we're dealing with psychological rather than physical danger, okay? We can actually keep re-triggering ourselves by thinking about the situation. And by now, you've likely already developed some sort of way of coping or helping you to calm down. Maybe a ritual of making and drinking a cup of tea, or going for a run, or maybe listening to some music. But the more quickly that you can recognize that you've been triggered and you take that space and begin to state shift, the easier and quicker that recovery time is going to be. So some of the most effective techniques work directly with our body to help calm down and regain that balance, like deep breathing and physical exercise. Whereas other methods work directly with our thoughts and our emotions, like self-reflection, emotional release, meditation, and prayer. There's also a fun grounding exercise that I like to do, which doesn't take too long. It's called the 5-4-3-2-1 grounding technique. You might have heard of it, but for those of you who don't, it goes like this. You will name 5 things that you see, 4 things that you can hear, 3 things that you can touch, 2 things that you can smell, and 1 thing that you can taste. I'll say it again in case you missed it. It's 5 things that you can see, 4 things that you can hear, 3 things that you can touch, 2 things that you can smell, and 1 thing that you can taste. Okay, and then finally, we're on to step 4, which is dealing with the situation. So we use that state shifting process to help bring ourselves back to a place of centeredness and inner balance and focus, where we now have basically the full access to our life experience and our ability to creatively solve problems. And from this space, we're now able to act and not simply react. So we can now look back at the original situation that triggered us and ask, well, is there something that needs to be done or not, right? Often we're triggered by events that actually don't require us to do anything other than calm down. If we do choose to act though, we can then assess the situation, we can get clear on our goal, and we can plan on how best to achieve that goal. So here's a quick review of the 4-step process in case you've just jumped on. Step number 1 is name it. The sooner that you notice that you're triggered, the quicker your recovery. Step 2, take space appropriately. Don't act when triggered, okay? Find some relatively graceful way of removing yourself from the triggering situation. Step 3, shift your state. Use any of a range of the state shifting tools to bring yourself back to a state of inner clarity and balance. And step 4 is to respond to the situation rather than react to it. And I thought that it would be nice to give you a few pro tips as well that can help. The first one being to be aware of projection, because trigger reactions are about projection. We predict the outcomes based on our past experiences. So if your parents were angrily violent towards you, you may be triggered by anger or raised voices in others, okay? So maybe if your first love cheated on you or left you for somebody else, you might find yourself being triggered when your current partner is texting or looking at their phone, and in your head, you're transported back to that time where maybe those were the signs that you overlooked with your first love when they were cheating. And so we make our reaction about the people. And when we stop doing that, we can then take our power back, okay? Because we're powerless when we can't change other people, right? But when we start then taking ownership of our reactions, we can take our power back, because then we're taking a step towards healing and letting go of that original core wound. And so another pro tip is to keep an open mind. And what I mean by that is that generally speaking, most people in your life don't try and make you feel bad on purpose, okay? Some of their actions or words that upset you could even be a byproduct of, their emotional triggers or other factors that maybe you aren't necessarily aware of. Everyone has unique emotions bubbling under the surface at any given time, and you may not know what's going on unless they tell you. Okay, so it's also easier to misinterpret behavior or intent when you don't know someone very well, and this makes it even more important to consider their perspective. This next tip might seem a little bit cliche, but communicate. Okay, when someone else's actions trigger your emotions, opening up may help you to avoid a similar situation with them in future. Use I statements and other healthy communication skills to address the situation. In some cases, it may help to challenge the other person to practice better communication. And if silent treatment or passive-aggressive behavior or unkind or sarcastic remarks are emotional triggers for you, try a polite, "What's on your mind?" or "Sorry, I'm not sure what you mean by that." Yeah. Okay, so the next tip I have for you is to not fight that inner voice. Okay, so if you're being triggered by an inner critic, don't respond with an opposing opinion, because this is going to start an internal war with a force that's sole training and mission is to put you down. Instead, recognize this voice as a time for a break in which you can action a self-care practice like an affirmation or a mantra. Something like, "I am worthy and deserving of success and happiness," or "I trust myself to handle whatever happens." Then we can start using these inner voices to become tools that help us to evolve into greater versions of ourselves. All right, toolkit time. I have 11 tools that you can use when you are triggered to get back into a centered state. Okay, seriously, I went all out today. 11. So I'm going to go through these rather quickly because they're pretty self-explanatory, but of course, if you have any questions or would like more information on any of them in particular, drop me a comment or a DM and I'll gladly walk you through them. Okay, so tool number 1 is breathing. Okay, when we're triggered, we typically either hold our breath or we start to hyperventilate. So carbon dioxide builds up and it creates that panicky feeling like when we've been underwater for too long. So the simplest state shifting tool is to begin to take deep breaths, increasing the amount of oxygen coming into our lungs. It's simple, but it's effective, okay? Especially if we catch our triggering early and before we spiral out of control. Tool number 2, move energy, okay? One of the most powerful and quickest ways to shift out of a triggered state is to engage in any form of vigorous physical exercise. So whether that's dancing, jogging, working out, or cycling, anything that gets the heart pumping. Singing is also it's also useful in increasing the flow of oxygen and helps to consume that excess energy that's created by that fight-flight response and releases the feel-good endorphins. So tool number 3 is to feel your feelings. And sometimes when we've been triggered, what we actually need is to just allow ourselves to feel, okay? Especially those deeper emotions that lie just underneath the first triggered response. Sometimes we just need to soften our heart, to give space for the more tender, more vulnerable feelings. Crying is okay and it's healing. So if you feel like you need to cry, then cry. Okay. Tool number 4 is self-soothing. And this might look like sitting down with a warm cup of tea or taking a bubble bath, lying on the earth or listening to soft music, whatever it is that you find nurturing and helpful in calming your nervous system. Tool number 5 is meditation or prayer. So meditation or prayer or chanting and other forms of spiritual practice are all really powerful tools for shifting our state. They are highly effective, but it helps if you've had or if you've developed a foundational practice before you try and make use of these in a triggered situation. Tool number 6 is a mind-body practice. So those who've developed practices such as yoga and Tai Chi or other forms of martial arts often find these to be powerful methods for state shifting when triggered. Tool number 7 is self-humor. And humor is really one of the greatest healing forces for human beings. Rather than getting frustrated at ourselves, for being triggered, it can be immensely liberating to begin to cultivate a sense of self-humor about our triggers, especially as we become more intimately familiar with our own triggers. Okay, it becomes possible to begin gently poking fun at ourselves, and also it's one of the fastest ways to diffuse the stress response. Tool number 8 is to change your physical environment. When triggered, our primitive brains often associate threat with our physical surroundings. So even going into a different room, or better if you can go outside, any change in your physical environment will help to diffuse that trigger. Tool number 9 is deep relaxation. Okay, our muscles tense up when we're triggered. So if you can sit back or lie down and close your eyes and slowly bring awareness into the different parts of your body, as you find areas that may seem tight, just breathe and invite those muscles to relax. Tool number 10 is self-reflection. So we begin to use our now functioning neocortex to unpack what actually is and is not going on. And we can question why our reactions are out of proportion to the situation. We could reflect on questions like, why did I act so strongly? Or what is being triggered in me from my past? Or am I absolutely sure that the meaning that I have placed on the situation is completely true? Is it absolutely true that this person is out to get me, or that the situation is hopeless, or that this is definitely going to lead to something terrible, or whatever? Is there another interpretation of events that might also be true? Is there possibly some opportunity for me in this situation? And tool number 11 is anchoring. Anchoring is a psychophysical tool that we use to pull ourselves out of our triggered state and into a state of power and clarity. And so we create anchors before we get triggered so that we can draw on that tool when we need it. So we begin by identifying what it feels like in our body when we're in that centered state and in our inner power. Then we can create a physical, visual, excuse me, or auditory cue. Hold on. Sorry. Talking way too much today. This is going on longer than we usually go. So basically, we then have the choice of then creating either a physical, a visual, or an auditory cue that can serve as an anchor to pull us back into that zone. So it looks something like this. For a physical anchor, we maybe find a body posture that embodies the experience of being in our place of power. Okay, and when we're triggered, then we physically assume the body posture. We take a number of deep breaths, and as we continue to settle more deeply into that posture, it increasingly evokes our felt sense of power and centeredness. The visual anchor works like this. We visualize a source of power that has a particular meaning for us. It could be an image from nature, like the river or the sun, maybe a spirit animal or a revered person, maybe a spiritual symbol. And when triggered, we can meditate on this image. With a series of deep breaths, we literally imagine that we're drawing the power represented by this image into our body until we start experiencing that power within us. And then with an auditory anchor, we basically create a short mantra or affirmation that evokes our sense of inner power. So some examples are be here now, or relax, release, ease, or anything else that feels good to you. So when triggered, linked with those deep breaths, we then repeat those phrases. And because it's formed internally, the beauty of this anchoring technique is that it can actually be done in a public setting. So I really hope that this has helped you today. I feel like I've given you quite a lot of tools to choose from that should help to make the state shifts as easy as possible for you. I'm not asking you to do all of them. Some of them might not work for you. Some might work better for you than others. It's really all about trying and testing and seeing what resonates and what works best for you. As I said, we're all different and we react and respond to things differently. So emotion regulation is a difficult skill to master for most people, and it's not always easy to identify triggers on your own. Your instinctive reactions to certain triggers can become so deeply ingrained in your behavior that you may not even realize how your reactions are causing yourself and others harm. So if you're too close to your triggers to recognize them and address their effects on your interactions, therapy or coaching can help. Okay, so I'm glad it's been helpful, Kim. Really happy to hear that. So therapy or coaching provides a safe and non-judgmental space to identify triggering situations and explore potential reasons behind the triggers, and maybe also help you to get down to your core wound so that you can start that healing process. A coach or a therapist can also help you practice using more productive communication strategies that will help to express your emotions in any situation. They can also offer guidance and support as you work to heal that source of your triggers. Just know you are not alone, okay? We can easily become victims of our triggers if we believe that everyone else is able to control theirs, okay? Triggers lose a lot of their power when we realize that other people that we like and trust are affected in similar ways that we are. Some degree of being triggered is just part of being human. Okay, you're never going to be able to get rid of them by suddenly reaching some level of enlightenment. Okay, short-term coping strategies can help you get better at dealing with specific emotional triggers as they come up, but that doesn't mean that you just have to get used to living with them. Okay, each time we interrupt those triggers and we do the 4-step practice that we talked about today, it's as if we're strengthening a muscle through repeated use, okay? And in this way, we're also laying new neural pathways that over time start to develop a new habit, okay? So now that you know what your triggers are, where they come from, and how to diffuse them, you can now use your newfound awareness to recognize when you're being triggered so that you can soothe it effectively. You can find the root cause, and then you can start working on healing that core wound. So in the comments, I'd love for you to tell me which of these tools resonated with you the most, or which one you can start using or practicing to diffuse your triggers when they come up. Okay, I know that you showed up today because you know that in one way, shape, or form, you are being triggered by situations or events or circumstances, and you're wanting to shift through this, and you want to take your life to the next level. And perhaps you don't think that you're capable of doing this alone. And that's okay, because I'm here and I have your back. So if you're ready to level up, and if it's time for you to get that support, just send me a DM to help you get there faster. You really don't have to do this alone. We are all born whole, okay? And I know that you have everything that you need within you right now to make all the changes so that you can finally have that life that you want and you can make it a reality. And for those of you who have watched this far, I've got a gift for you. If you are one of the first 5 people to DM me right now, I'm going to gift you a free 30-minute breakthrough session with me, valued at $450, okay? Where we will take your biggest limiting belief and we're going to crush it. And I promise you, I'm not here to sell you anything or ask you for anything. But if after you can see how powerful the session was and you want more information about how to work with me, when I reopen my doors to my one-on-one intensive program in July, I'll be more than happy to give you the information. But if you don't ask for it, I'm not going to push you on it either. Okay? You have absolutely nothing to lose. So drop me a DM. If you joined late, please watch the replay. Okay? We've been talking about emotional triggers, what they are, where they came from, and how to soothe them. When they come up again, I have given you 11 tools to choose from to help you shift into a centered, more empowered state. Kim says she likes all of them. Kim, I would love for you to test all of them and to let me know which ones have worked the best for you. The fact that you've shown up to watch this today tells me that you are showing up for yourself and that you are taking action and that you can absolutely do anything that you set your mind to. And I'm so, so, so proud of you for showing up for yourself today. So take a moment to acknowledge and honor yourself for that. Again, I really, really hope that today was valuable and that you'll start to recognize when you're being triggered and to start using those tools to soothe that trigger so that you can start living a happier and more fulfilled and empowered life. I'd love for you to drop me a note when you've had a chance to practice this 4-step method and to let me know how it goes for you. Next week, we're going to be talking about finding your purpose in life. Okay? So many women that I speak to have often said to me that they just feel empty and unfulfilled and don't really know how to find their purpose in life. Or maybe they want to get out of their 9-to-5 and start their own business but have absolutely no idea what it is that they want to do. They don't feel the passion and the excitement that they can see that others feel towards their businesses or careers or life in general. And I don't know, perhaps you like your job but it doesn't excite you anymore. Or maybe you're wanting to start your own business but you aren't sure what you really want to do. Maybe you're feeling stuck or like something is somehow missing from your life and you long to find your purpose, but you don't know where to start. So in next week's live, I'm going to be sharing some strategies which can help you to reveal your purpose so that you can start to live a more meaningful and fulfilled life. So don't forget to check out the events section in the group and RSVP so that you will be reminded of when the broadcast starts. So I'm looking super forward to speaking with you then. And until then, have an absolutely incredible weekend. I am going to see you next Friday, same time, same place. Bye for now.